Welcome to Forests, Folklore, and Fantasy. My name is Kelly, but I write and publish under my initials, K.M. Rice. Whoever you are and wherever you are most welcome here, and I want to thank you for gifting me some precious moments of your time to listen today. In keeping with the month of March, today's episode is going to have a look at St. Patrick's Day as a holiday. St. Patrick is a figure, some Irish history to give you context for all this information, and some possible discrepancies in his account, and a bit of what we know about pagan Ireland before Christianization and how all of these influences converged to create the holiday that we now know as St. Patrick's Day. A little backstory on my personal life in relation to this subject. I am currently in an international relationship with an Irishman from a Gaeltacht region, and as such, I have spent quite a bit of time in Ireland over the past several years, so I am somewhat familiar with portions of the country and what the culture is like. And the day that I'm recording this here in California, it's very cold and very rainy, and it just feels so fitting to be taking this journey through Irish history and folklore and faith on a day like today. I will begin by saying that St. Patrick's Day is an Irish Catholic holiday, and it has often been celebrated or marked as a quiet religious holiday in Ireland, where people would go to Mass and do other Catholic rituals of worship. Over here in the New World, it has morphed, as it were, into an overall celebration of Irish heritage, or rather, a common commercialized public perception of what Irish heritage entails. And that is true in many other countries as well. It more or less is one of those bizarrely common situations where a holiday is taken up by the diaspora, given a different significance, meaning, and means of celebration, and then re-imported back into the old country with a bit of that flavor. We see that happening in particular with Ireland and the United States with the birth of Halloween as we know it, and also, of course, with this holiday, with St. Patrick's Day. In the United States alone, 32 million people self-report being of Irish descent. That is 9.7% of the population. That said, probably not all of those people are, I'll just say, genetically Irish if they were to do genetic testing, but that is the family story. That is the oral history of where that many people, 32 million people, report to have come from. So bear in mind, the population of the Irish Republic is just under 5 million. Now, it wasn't always that way, but I think it's important to bear in mind that that number, 32 million, is only here in the US. It doesn't include Canada. It doesn't include Australia or New Zealand or any of the other places, England, that the Irish diaspora exists in. So suffice it to say, there are far, far, far more people of Irish descent outside of Ireland than there are inside of Ireland. But to understand the true origins of this holiday within Ireland, it's helpful to understand a little bit about the island and its history. I am quite a nerd about Ireland and Irish history, so it would be easy for me to talk for hours on this subject, but suffice it to say, this is just meant to be an overview of some of the information that is directly pertinent to the discussion around St. Patrick's Day. But you can certainly explore that passion I have for Irish history through several of my novels, not the least of which being the Afterworld novels, which really delve into Irish history and folklore. Modern Ireland is an island off the coast of Europe in the North Atlantic, and it's divided into two countries. The Irish Republic has the largest landmass and comprises 26 counties. So if you're listening to this in the States or in Canada, counties are like states or provinces. Northern Ireland, which is in the northeast, has 6 counties and is part of the United Kingdom. Ireland was historically populated by Celtic peoples, and I want to put a little asterisk there because the term Celtic, as I've probably mentioned before, is actually a very broad umbrella term and doesn't refer to any sort of race or even necessarily any form of ethnicity, but rather a language. It's more or less used to group a family of languages and a fairly consistent artistic style and culture that was once very widespread across Europe and then arrived in the United Kingdom, what is now the United Kingdom and Ireland. And there is a lot of discussion over how that happened and what that means. But suffice it to say that I'm going to use the popular term here, Celtic, to describe the people of Ireland, even though I know that's a complicated concept. While Ireland has, of course, seen immigration from people from other parts of the world, it is by and large populated by the descendants of those Celtic people. In fact, it used to all be a Irish-speaking region. If you didn't know, in Ireland, Irish Gaelic isn't called Irish Gaelic, it's just called Irish. There's English and there's Irish. Due to the history of colonization at the hands of the British Empire, the use of the Gaelic tongue sharply declined. However, it still survives in regions known as Gaeltachts. In those places, most people are bilingual. They can speak English and they can speak Irish. In the Gaeltacht that I'm most familiar with, my generation, elder millennial, would have grown up speaking both, but the parental generation above that more than likely would have grown up with Irish as their main language and English as their acquired language. So there's definitely a generational shift happening, but I can speak from my own personal experience that it's still quite common to walk into a pub in the Gaeltacht and have conversations in Irish happening all around you. I had some very kind people switch to English, and they said that they were doing that because I was there and they didn't want me to feel excluded, which I found very open and welcoming and kind. And I have endeavored to learn some Irish, but it's a tricky language if you haven't been raised with it. So, as I always say, my pronunciations throughout this episode, take them with a grain of salt. Don't take them as the authentic pronunciations. I'm trying, but I am not there yet. Ancient Ireland was populated by tribes or clans, many of which were frequently warring with each other, as often happens on islands and even on continents. Each tribe or kingdom had its own leaders. There was a period of time in which most of those leaders would have answered to a person who was known as the High King of Ireland in one fashion or another. And the legends tell of the multiple kings and leaders of Ireland gathering upon the hill of Tara outside of about over an hour outside of Dublin and gathering to essentially have a summit, like a summit on a summit. Maybe that's where that word comes from, actually. But gathering to have a meeting of minds and make some decisions and discuss things over with the High King. The Romans actually never invaded Ireland. They had enough on their plate with Britannia and with what is now modern Scotland. Many of you probably know that they attempted to invade what is now Scotland. They called it Caledonia. And they couldn't do it. The terrain was too rough and the people were even rougher. So their solution was to build a big wall under several different emperors, but it's credited as Hadrian's Wall. It's known as Hadrian's Wall from the emperor who did a lot of the work commissioning it. And that was their solution. Just keep the Pictish people out. Just keep them out. And I think since the Roman Empire was stretched thin enough as it was, they looked over at Ireland, which, by the way, they refer to as Hibernia, which roughly means the land of eternal winter. And they didn't even want to try it. So thankfully for us, because if it had been invaded, there would have been a lot more rupture in Irish history and in the history passed down to us than there would have been otherwise. Thankfully, they never invaded it. There is certainly evidence of Roman visitation. There is a site called Newgrange, which is a Neolithic tomb, and the opening aligns with the first light on the winter solstice. But there has been evidence of Roman jewelry and artifacts, and we seem to be fairly sure that even under the Roman rule in Britain, people were coming to be tourists to see this Neolithic site in Ireland and sometimes accidentally leaving a trinket behind. And I think that's really cool. I think it's really fun for me to think that even back then, there was obviously a leisure class that was like, I want to go see this place. This place sounds really neat. For historical context to help you orient the period of time I'm talking about, the Romans, by most accounts, successfully invaded Britain in year 60 of the Common Era. And the year 410 of the Common Era is when their rule there more or less came to a close or began to come to a close because of trouble happening in Rome and the troops needing to be recalled back to protect the actual heart of Rome. So throughout that whole period of time, in fact, if you know your later history, the tables were more or less turned because the Irish were actually the antagonists, and the Irish were often committing raids against the Romano-British and stealing people, which will come into play in a few moments here. But beginning in 1169, once the Romans had pulled out and things had settled a bit on the island of Britannia, which is a whole nother history, just suffice it to say that they had gathered their wits about them again. A series of conquests were carried out by the people of Britain, and those conquests really were colonialism as we know it today, and it led to 800 years of oppression, subjugation, and servitude. Though there were numerous revolts and attempts at revolution by the Irish, they were always stamped out by their overlords, and the population often suffered very dire retribution. It was not until the Irish War of Independence that occurred between 1919 and 1921 that the Republic of Ireland was born. the treaty signed with the British in 1921 included relinquishing the northernmost 6 counties, which were largely Protestant, which is another backstory of history. That's due to the British plantation system in the 16th and 17th centuries. And so the plantation system, if I can summarize it quickly, was, again, the British were having trouble colonizing the native Irish, and their solution, much like they did in parts of Scotland, was to take very British people and just stick them there and say they live here now. And so families were literally being kicked out of their houses and told, this guy lives here now, and not only that, he's in charge of this whole area. You're all under him now. This ruling class that was being imposed upon the native Irish were often Scottish or English by birth, and often, like lords, often of the upper echelon of society. And as such, they were often Protestant, and the natives were Catholic. So we'll touch more on that in a little bit. But if you know even a little bit of modern Irish history, you will know that there has been a long-standing division between Protestant communities and Catholic communities, and this is part of it. So when the treaty was signed with the British in 1921, the terms were to relinquish the northernmost 6 counties, which again were largely Protestant, to the British Empire, and thus we have the creation of modern Northern Ireland. And again, it actually is much more complicated than that. Those counties to this day identify culturally in a large way as being part of the United Kingdom rather than part of the Republic. But I'm not trying to speak for the people of Northern Ireland or to say that they have any form of a cohesive identity. But I'm just attempting to suggest that there are several different reasons that this happened and why it has caused some anguish and conflict in the decades since. So with that as your groundwork, I'm going to attempt to rein myself back in and talk about St. Patrick himself. So St. Patrick was an actual legitimate historical figure. Not everyone knows that. He was born in what is now Britain in the 4th century of the Common Era. His birth name was allegedly Maewyn Succat, or Succat, again, my pronunciation. And he was of Romano-British heritage. Most of his story actually comes to us by his own hand, for he penned 2 letters that are collectively known as Confessio, usually titled in English as the Confessions of St. Patrick. When Patrick was only 16 years old, he was kidnapped in an Irish raid on Romano-British soil and taken back to Ireland. So again, that's why I wanted to explain some of that history about the back and forth between these 2 islands that have so often been in conflict with each other. And when he was brought back to Ireland, he was used as a shepherd. Now, slavery in Ireland was not quite as bleak as slavery has been in other cultures and at other points in time. The social status of slaves was very low. However, they were still afforded a social status and had the ability to climb the social ranks to freedom so long as they did not commit any crimes. So Patrick had a lot of time to contemplate life, as he spent quite a bit of time alone as a shepherd. Christianity was not uncommon in Britain at the time, And in fact, he admitted to having very little interest in that faith until his experience in Ireland when he was alone in the fields for days at a time. He had a spiritual awakening, and he often prayed 100 times a day. And he says that the Almighty spoke to him through a dream, urging him to take a ship waiting for him back to Britain. After 6 years of servitude, he was 22 years old, and he made the brave decision to walk away from his captors and follow this calling, these instructions from the Almighty. He did manage to board a ship returning to Britain, and he reunited with his overjoyed family who had thought they would never see him again. While he was at home, he once more heard the voice of God summoning him to return to Ireland to preach the word and to spread the Christian faith. After 20 years of training in Britain, religious training, Patrick returned to Ireland. Now, again, this is just like a Spark Notes version of his story. So if you are curious, please do look up more resources and find out more about this man's amazing life. So Patrick was uniquely positioned to spread Christianity throughout Ireland because he had lived among the Irish for 6 years. He knew their society and he knew how their culture worked. He arrived and started preaching Christianity and wasn't very well received at first, but he persisted and continued to spread what is known as the good word. And he is credited with more or less single-handedly facilitating the only known purely peaceful conversion of an entire population. But the question remains, is that actually what happened? Because again, he himself is the originator of this information. Or I should say, most of this information. It's difficult to discern the truth when dealing with ancient writers, much less when dealing with what may potentially be antiquated self-aggrandizing propaganda or a self-aggrandizing biography. Other than Patrick's own account, there are several other records from the 7th century chronicling his life. So again, not necessarily contemporary to his lifetime, but shortly after. Those writers include, oh boy, forgive me here, Murcuro Moroku Mactheni and Tiercan, the foster son of Ultan of Ardbrachan, who also became a saint. And I apologize, I just made everyone's ears bleed and butchered that completely. But Ultan wrote the Book of Ultan, which sadly is now lost to us. But it survives through the above-mentioned writers who made reference to it in their own works. This is a curiosity that continues to intrigue me and a source of grief for me, this idea that we have lost books that we know about. There are many ancient histories around the world that make reference to books that contained even more history, and they just haven't survived. And that just makes me so sad, and I live in hope that one day we'll uncover some of them. In these texts, Patrick is seen in a very different light than that under which he portrayed himself, which is not a surprise. Even those of us with the best of intentions are often viewed differently by our peers and contemporaries. Again, even though the writers here were not specifically contemporaries, but they would have spoken to people who were contemporaries of Patrick. They could confirm that he was indeed a man of God and that he had the motivation to spread the word of God. But they also called him a mighty warrior. And we don't know in what context. We don't know if that actually meant he bore weapons and led a group of warriors, or if it's meant to express that he was a religious zealot who desecrated many pre-Christian and pagan religious spaces to further what he saw as the right way to worship. They documented that he was not above using bribery and manipulation to convert and coerce his followers. There are a lot of very gossipy accounts that include highborn women and St. Patrick and his attempts to manipulate them. In fact, even in his own letters, he admits to having been put on trial on at least one occasion over these bribes. So it must have been so well known that he figured he couldn't even live it down. So he better own it. St. Patrick is also credited with having once stood on a hillside and delivered a sermon that drove all of the snakes of Ireland into the sea. And for that reason, there are no snakes in Ireland. But Ireland has always been a relatively cool climate. It has likely never had snakes. But some have pushed to interpret this myth as a metaphor and to interpret the snakes in Ireland as the Druids. And the Druids were the holy people and counselors and scientists and poets and legislators and lawyers of pagan Ireland and Britain. The Druids were so important to their society that they were the very first group the Romans targeted and slaughtered when invading Britain between 50 and 60 of the Common Era, because they understood that if they destroyed the Druids, these tentpole figures in society, they would likewise destroy the fabric of the indigenous British way of life. So it was very much welded as a conquering tactic to go after this class. And because of knowing what happened in what is now Britain, that's led to many hypothesizing that this metaphor of driving the snakes out could indeed be a reference to driving out the religious leaders. If that's the case, it wasn't 100% successful, and we have more surviving documentation of who the Druids were and what they did in Ireland than we do anywhere else, because they were also common in mainland Europe as part of the Celtic culture. And of course, war was waged upon them there by the Roman Empire as well. Aiding this idea of St. Patrick as a colonizer or a man of conquest is, by his own hand again, the story that he once intervened with his god to put a stop to atrocious heathen pagan Irish customs. There was a stone found in Killycluggan in County Cavan in Ireland that is roughly cone-shaped, and it's probably from the Iron Age. It's got lateen designs. That's a branch of Celtic culture. It was discovered broken into several pieces and has since been reconstructed. And interestingly, it was found very close to a Bronze Age stone circle where it possibly once stood at the center. You can view the reconstructed stone in the Cavan County Museum, which I would love to go see at some point. And it is decorated with several different swirling patterns, very typical to Celtic artwork. And the thought is that at one point it was likely also painted potentially with gold, that the swirling carving designs in it could have been filled with paint, and that would have made it even more of a visually stunning object. It has been assigned as being dedicated to several different Irish gods, one of them being Crom Cruach, another as Crom Duv, but we actually just don't know what it was used for. We do know it was likely a place of worship. Crom means bent or crooked, and so it's possible that it was a structure that perhaps looked more like a statue and that it was leaning to the side. There are a lot of theories that although it's cone-shaped now, it may have originally had some form of a representation of a human head on it to look more like a person. Its original height was likely around 6 feet, though that's without the hypothesized head. And it was discovered buried in 1921 by a landowner. And again, it has since been reconstructed. So we don't know completely what it was used for by the indigenous Irish of that area. However, Patrick tells us that the kings of Ireland used to come there to commit sacrifice, a human sacrifice. In fact, one story says that in order to appease this god and have a fruitful harvest, people would bring their firstborn child, and apologies, this is a little graphic, smash their heads against the rock and use that blood to bless the rock and thus bless themselves and the land and imbue the land with fertility. And in Patrick's story, the High King and his followers were gathered at this rock, and they were all prostrate in prayer. So they were stretched on the ground with their heads bowed. Different accounts say 1/3 to 3/4 of the island's population was gathered there to perform this sacrifice. And Patrick showed up and said, "This is disgusting and horrible, and you all can't do this." And he took his famous staff that's like a crook on the end, and he smashed the rock and released the devil or the demon that had dwelled within it, and thus saved them all. But while these kings were all lying there with their heads prostrate, their own god, this demon, killed them. Thankfully, Patrick was there to round up the survivors and take them to a body of water and immediately baptize them and bring them into his fold. And a church dedicated to Patrick still stands near to this spot. I mean, does that not sound a little sus? It sounds a little to me like something else may have happened there. Now, archaeologically, again, there's this hypothesis that the stone originally had a head and that maybe Patrick and his followers did break off the head, because there are some carvings on the cone shape of the stone that could indicate like a human body, and similar stones that looked like that, along with like a representation of a head, have been found in other Celtic sites in Europe. So that part of the story could be true. He could have broken off the head and, freed the people from their false idol in his eyes. But we all know gods don't just float out of stones and just happen to kill all the local leaders. In fact, that sounds disturbingly similar to what Charlemagne did to the Anglo-Saxons in the 700s. Committed a genocide against their people and then held the leaders at sword point and said, "Get baptized and convert now or the rest of your people will die." I'm bringing that up because it would not be impossible for something similar to have happened, and it's not unheard of. Charlemagne was a particularly brutal example of violent conversion. But wouldn't it be sad and ironic if Patrick, the man who is accredited with single-handedly peacefully converting an entire population, actually committed such atrocities or was part of a movement that committed such atrocities. We just don't know. I'm not sure if we'll ever know, but I think it is important for these alternative perspectives from the 7th century to be heard, so that we're not only given the monovision that Patrick had of himself, that we're given perhaps a fuller picture of what actually happened. It's also worth mentioning that this is the only written account with any form of documentation of human sacrifice in Ireland, and could very well be a case that we see quite often throughout history. When history is written by the victors, they do whatever they can to justify their actions and to other the people that they are conquering or colonizing, or in this case, potentially converting, by depicting them as the most disgusting heathens you could ever possibly imagine, so that they can be seen as saviors. He is also credited as holding up a shamrock, a clover with 3 leaves, and using it to explain to the Irish people the concept of the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost all being part of one whole. And that simple moment was what made it click for the Irish people. And they're like, we get it. We get it, dude. We're all Christian now. This story seems to be another myth that popped up long after Patrick's death. He never even mentions it in his letters, and there's actually no reference to this in any ancient text. But nevertheless, the shamrock has persisted and been adopted as a symbol of St. Patrick, and also by extension as a symbol of Ireland itself. It's not uncommon to see a picture of St. Patrick holding up a shamrock. But again, I do think it is important to state what we know and what we don't know, just as important as it is to state other hypotheses and other accounts and what we can draw from those accounts to perhaps form a more balanced, cohesive picture of what was going on. But it is no secret that Patrick became a saint, and his death day is actually March 17th. So it was observed as a holy day and is observed as a holy day by Irish Catholics. And as I said in the intro, many communities marked this day by attending service and having quiet contemplation. So how did it get from a quiet religious holiday to what you could call a wild secular party? Let's have a look. As we've already covered, there are far more people who claim to be of Irish descent outside of Ireland than there are inside of Ireland. The US and several other countries as well saw large waves of immigration from Ireland. In fact, probably the largest wave of immigration from Ireland in the 1840s and the 1850s. This was due to what is called the Great Famine. Starting in 1845, a form of a disease known as a blight spread through the fields, decimating the potato crop. It was like this black slimy mold that rendered them inedible, and once the soil was infected, it spread. The potato was of a certain variety that could provide most of the nutritional requirements for people, and it was the main food source for most tenant Irish farmers. Many families faced starvation and eviction from their homes by the British lords who owned the land that they farmed because they could no longer pay the rent. Many Irish chose to instead emigrate. The United States received the bulk of the immigrants, while others went to Australia and the United Kingdom and Canada. Before the famine, the population of Ireland is estimated to be around 8 million. Again, it's roughly 4 million, just under 5 million today in the Republic. It's estimated that 1 million people emigrated, while at least another million died. I won't get too into it, but they started creating coffins with releasing back so that the coffins could be repurposed after the funeral for the next corpse. Of those who emigrated, fleeing these terrible circumstances, 1 in 5 died during the crossing over the Atlantic. The ships were crowded, they were dirty, they had diseases in them, and many of the passengers were already very malnourished. As such, these ships are often known today in Ireland as coffin ships. It's worth noting that Ireland at the time, again, was ruled by the British Empire, who could have taken action to aid or alleviate the famine. Because potatoes were not the only crop grown in Ireland. Many Irish tenants also grew barley and other foodstuffs and other grains, but those were for the British and had to be sent to Britain. The potatoes, again, were the farmers' means of feeding their own families. But had the British taken action to cease the grain import, or at least reduce it, the famine could have been lessened, if not abated altogether. For this reason, many modern historians are reframing the famine as a genocide. Ireland was largely Catholic, and the only meager aid provided by the British was only given to the Irish Catholics who were willing to convert to Protestantism. And as I briefly touched upon in the beginning of this episode, you know that that wasn't just about switching the lens of faith. It was much deeper and had much more cultural significance than that. There were those who spoke out very viscerally at the time about how wrong this was, and allegedly Queen Victoria did what she could to try to get Parliament, or what was Parliament at the time, to take action and could not get any traction. As a very poignant moment in history, the Choctaw Nation in North America in 1847 scraped together $170 and sent them to Ireland to try to help them. In 2020, there was a GoFundMe set up to raise money for the Navajo and the Hopi during the coronavirus pandemic, and it got shared in the Irish Times, and so many Irish people donated, wanting to show some expression of gratitude for what the Native American peoples had done for them in their hour of need, that they raised over $2 million. And I just think that's so beautiful. But sadly, the money that the Choctaw sent over wasn't able to do much to help the Irish. And as you can tell by the statistics I've given throughout this episode, the Irish population has never recovered. However, the population outside of Ireland, known as the diaspora, has thrived. And while the Irish faced much prejudice when first arriving in America, and in fact for several generations after that, they eventually gained equal footing with their fellow European immigrant groups. And the the diaspora is largely responsible for the popularization of St. Patrick's Day, which has morphed into a cultural celebration of all things Irish. The first St. Patrick's Day parades were started by Irish immigrants on the East Coast of the United States. And as most people do not need much of an excuse to have a party, and there were plenty of Irish Americans, the parades escalated into a full-blown festival-style holiday. We are familiar now with orange-bearded leprechauns, the color green, and beer to mark the holiday, but none of these things have anything to do with the holy day. In fact, it was not until recent decades that the holiday was marked by anything other than Mass in the Old Country. Our depictions of leprechauns actually stem from very cringe-worthy racist cartoons of the Irish in the 18 and 1900s. I mean, have you ever wondered why they wear those little vests and those bowler hats? The beer is also linked to this stereotype. For many immigrants, depressed and discriminated against as they were once they came to the free world, the land of opportunity, and found that it wasn't that, they turned to alcohol as they attempted to cope. It's also not super widely known or spoken about, but circus clowns back in the day were meant to mock a drunken Irishman. That's why they had red hair and a red swollen nose and big clumsy feet staggering around like they were drunk. So now that you know the somewhat disturbing background on where some of these commercialized elements, I would say appropriated elements of alleged Irish culture come from, you may be left wondering, what about the color green? Many would give the very simple answer that green is associated with St. Patrick's Day and the Irish because it stems from the Emerald Isle. And while that is partially true, and I can attest that Ireland is indeed a very beautifully green place, it's not the full story. After the Irish War of Independence in the 1920s, the tricolor Irish flag as we know it today was born. The green symbolizes the Irish Republicans and Catholics who fought for independence, the white for everlasting peace, and the orange for the Protestant population once allied with William of Orange. As most of us know, sadly, everlasting peace was not achieved. The Irish War of Independence immediately gave rise to the Irish Civil War, a dispute over the relinquishing of the 6 counties in the north to Britain, as we learned about earlier. This dispute continues in some way to this day, as the island is still divided into 2 countries. A period known as the Troubles, which was between the 1960s and 1990s, saw heightened violence, largely in Northern Ireland, between the 2 factions of Republicans and Unionists. So an Irish Republican is someone who wants the entire island of Ireland to be part of the Irish Republic, and a Unionist is someone who wants to continue union with the United Kingdom. Some of you may have seen Dairy Girls, that wonderful Netflix series. You'll have picked up on some of this in the background. That's set in the 1990s. Again, while we often, and in fact the media has often simplified this into a dispute between Catholics and Protestants, again, this issue has far more to do with socioeconomic and cultural differences than religious ones, going all the way back to the 16 and 1700s when the English were implementing the plantation system and brought people in to supplant and repress the native population. During the Troubles, and indeed reaching back much further, the Irish Republican Army, who you may know as the IRA, was largely funded by sympathetic Irish Americans. Given that green is the color of the Irish Republic, it was worn on St. Patrick's Day over here in the States in support of the Republican cause for United Ireland. If a fellow Irish American or immigrant was seen on St. Patrick's Day not supporting a united Ireland through wearing green, they were often pinched or worse as punishment. As far as another one of these oddities associated with the holiday, this phrase, "kiss me, I'm Irish," is thought to originate from a custom that you can still participate in to this day. At Blarney Castle in County Cork, there is a stone associated with many different legends, some of which being about a tragic love between a fairy woman and a mortal man. And the stone was, I believe, the last place he laid his head before she transported him to Tir na nÓg as he lay dying. But again, there are many legends associated with this stone, but the story goes that if you kiss it, you will be given the gift of gab. And the gift of gab means that you have a way with language and a way with ingratiating yourself and persuading yourself, or persuading others, rather. That story also allegedly originates from the reign of Elizabeth I of England, who was continuously attempting to get Lord Blarney to heal, and that he would not do what she wanted. Don't quote me on this. I can't remember if it was swearing fealty or giving her money or what it was, but he would charm her in his letters with all these elaborate reasons on why she was so great, but he just couldn't do what she wanted at the time. And she was so amused by them that she let it slide for a really long time and got to the point where it became a term in the language of her court, and then by extension all of English, like, oh, it's just a load of Blarney. So the story goes that if you kiss the Blarney Stone, you will be given the same gift that Lord Blarney once had. That account may just be another folktale associated with the castle and with the stone. I was speaking off the cuff when I said that, so I didn't take the time to look it up. But please do look it up yourself and find out more about the rich history of this site in Ireland. I myself have kissed the Blarney Stone, and to do it, it's quite complicated. You have to lie on your back by a castle wall, and there's a big gap. Crane your neck backward, and then kiss this surface that is grossly worn smooth by thousands of other lips before yours. I have to say, though, there's a chance that it works, because I was taking my first ever fiction class, and the feedback I got from my very tough professor was, "You certainly have the gift of gab." And, that was a few months after I kissed the Blarney Stone. I was like, it worked. It freaking worked. So supposedly that's where the association of "kiss me, I'm Irish" came from. I don't know if the concept there is you'll get some of the luck or the gift of gab imparted to you if you kiss an Irish person. I don't know. But there you have it. There are a lot of other idiosyncrasies with our popularized perceptions of the Irish that I don't really have the time to get into, but they're things like the luck of the Irish. Nobody has any concept of what that means. Like, nobody knows where that came from. The Irish, if by most accounts, been historically very unlucky. So my joke has always been that the luck of the Irish is that you survived. There's also there's a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. That's never been an Irish thing. Neither has Top of the Morning, by the way. Don't believe the movies. But the only idea we have over where the gold at the end of the rainbow came from is that there used to be a phrase, you're as sure to find a pot of gold as you are to find the end of a rainbow, meaning it's not going to happen. And that maybe someone heard that and got confused or misquoted it, and then it just took off. So there's a lot of bizarre things that are ascribed to the Irish by Irish Americans that the Irish are left scratching their heads at. If you were to visit Ireland today, you would find celebrations not dissimilar from those held by communities here that have a large Irish American population. Again, because like so many things in Irish history, what came to America and was returned to Ireland took root slightly different than how it left. And I was there for a St. Patrick's Day in County Kerry, and there's a beautiful parade, a St. Patrick's Day parade. Everyone was wearing the cheesy hair clips and things like that that demonstrate Irish pride in shamrocks and green, orange, and white, and the pubs were packed and full of singing, and the crack was mighty. So I find it fascinating to see the ebb and flow of cultural identity across continents and across nations, and I would feel very lucky that I was able to experience that. But there you have it, the somewhat convoluted and a bit dark origins of St. Patrick's Day. And I say dark just because so much of Irish history is dark, and then there's the whole thing of like, did St. Patrick actually kill people? I don't know. It very much stands in contradiction to how he has been marketed and presented for many years by the Catholic Church. But again, I think it's important for these potential contradictory elements to be brought to light. So I hope this has enriched your understanding not only of St. Patrick's Day, but of Irish culture in general, and helps inform how you celebrate this year. As I've shared before, my family in part comes from Ireland, and we are just as guilty as everyone else in our festive, secular way of celebrating St. Patrick's Day. It's become a tradition for us to just celebrate our heritage, and we do so by usually having corned beef and cabbage. Every once in a while I'm allowed to cook an actual traditional Irish meal like Irish stew, but we make it with beef, not lamb. It's soda bread, and we make what's called a grasshopper pie, which is made with an Oreo crust and mint ice cream, and it's delicious. And we watch one of our family's favorite films, which I highly recommend. It was made in the 90s, and it's called The War of the Buttons. It's just a riot, and it's a fantastic Irish film based on a French book, oddly enough, but it's a fantastic, wonderful, beautiful movie. And that's our celebration, more or less. And of course, we go all out and decorate the house with I always want it to look like a leprechaun vomited in the living room, because I just love the tackiness. I love the tackiness of the commercialization of all these things. Now, don't get me wrong, there was certainly a period of my time in my much younger days when I was like, stupid, all this Lucky Charms crap having to do with like Ireland and St. Patrick's Day. That's not what it's like. But I then went full circle and just became proof of the hypothesis that at the end of the day, everyone's just looking for an excuse to celebrate. So, thank you again, dear listener, for gifting me some of your time. If you have enjoyed this episode, I do sincerely hope you'll give it a like, a follow, a rating on whatever your preferred platform is, and perhaps even share it with someone who you think would also enjoy learning the content. As always, you can keep up with me and interact with me via my social media, which you can find in the show notes. And of course, I would love to also extend a heartfelt thank you to my patrons on Patreon who have a big influence on this show. And you are more than welcome to have a look around and join for free by following the link in the comments, or rather in the show notes, by following the link in the notes. Until next time, may your hearth be warm and your heart be full.